Hey everybody, welcome to What's a Function. I'm your host, John Firth, and Brian Dagan's joining me today.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk about Entra ID,
Mhm.
which is kind of a baseline for getting into the security field of Microsoft. So let's just get started with what's the function of Entra ID?
Well, Entra ID is the identity part of the triad. So our security offering Protect, we're focused on the identity, the device, and the data. And the identity is how you prove who you say you are and prove what you're authorized to access. And Entra is the centralized identity provider in Microsoft land.
And let's say that I'm using something like G Suite or Box.com or Dropbox. Can I still utilize those other platforms alongside of using Entra?
Yep. Most of those have published enterprise applications that you can just slot right in. If your provider supports SAML authentication as well, you can stand up that relationship as well, which basically says to that SaaS provider like Monday.com or whatever that my Entra is the authoritative source of identity information for access to my Salesforce tenant or Monday
Whatever.
tenant,
Yeah.
whichever, and grants you access that way.
Yeah, it's kind of nice. So we can do centralized identity across all the applications, single source of truth.
Yep.
What about managing those types of applications? How does Intra ID allow us to manage different apps from different providers and maybe not just manage the application and who has access, but the level of access that they have?
Yep. So in SAML land, you have the notion of a claim, and you can customize the claim that is being provided to Monday.com or whatever that says, I'm a member of group X, Y, and Z.
Yes.
Within Monday.com, you would have permissions assigned to each one of those groups. And by having Entra as your centralized identity provider, you can dynamically add or remove people in that one place, and you don't have to go into Monday. You don't have to go and add people to special groups within your line of business applications. You just adjust the group that they're in Entra, and they automatically pick up the roles that they should have in any of the connected enterprise applications.
And one of the nice features that we've started to use here is dynamic grouping.
Yep.
So actually going in, writing an expression that automatically puts that person in a group as soon as they're created.
Yep.
So that for us has really actually cut down on licensing spread, which happens all the time when someone leaves the organization, you get a new person in, you might just accidentally buy a second license and leave the old one around, which can be costly over time.
Mm-hmm.
And even within your Microsoft 365 tenant, this can happen. One of the features that we were pushing, I think like last month or the month before, was trying to get all of our basic level licensing, even within Microsoft, handled using dynamic license. And I think we've seen a pretty good increase of limiting account exposure that way.
Yep.
And actually securing our environment a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yep, agree. And with the dynamic grouping, you inherit based on the attributes. For example, which office you're in,
Mm-hmm.
and then what meeting rooms you might have access to book. For
Yep.
example, you could get that granular with it. Um, the uh, the other advantage of doing everything through Entra is you have the centralized governance of that. So if you want to set up an identity governance license, you can say, for these particular groups, you would have a reviewer set to say, okay, every 30 days they need to go in and validate that these individual employees need access to this resource. And if not, just done and
Yeah.
remove them. So it's kind of a belt and suspenders approach to what we all know is human error inherent in managing any identity provider is, forget to remove them from a group or they change job function and nobody told you. Well, the previous line manager or whatever would get the report and say, oh, wait, they haven't worked in this division in a while.
Yeah.
Let's just go ahead and remove them from it.
User hygiene is something that I talked about a couple days ago, but it's kind of
Is it that bad?
it's kind of crazy how it is it's the core of most organizations, right? Your identity is the core.
Yep.
But user hygiene is pretty awful. Active Directory is usually out of date. Managers are not correctly put in there unless you build around that. So by doing things like you're saying with access reviews, adding dynamic grouping, this kind of forces more hygiene into the system and allows us to keep the entire environment secure, to be honest.
Yeah, most of the data breaches that you hear about, it's usually an easy way in, a low privileged account.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a test account. that was compromised by an attacker that someone had forgotten about, and they were doing scan to email testing, 3 years ago, and they forgot that account even existed. So, yeah,
or even I've seen some bad practice where it's just they go in and their practice for the organization is just reset the user's password when they leave, and then assign something out to whoever takes their place. That's actually really bad. You need to block the account sign in, period, because that password could be, spray attacked or something like that, and they could get through. And even if, like you said, if it's a low level account, that can still be used to cause damage. They could start man in the middling, like email chains or something. Maybe users don't all know that user has left the organization. That account pops online again, and they're like, oh, okay, they're back or whatever.
Yep. And the attacker will typically lay low and slow, initially at least. If they get a compromised username and password and there doesn't happen to be multi-factor authentication turned on, they'll gain access to that account. They'll set up some mailbox rules that will send them anything that comes into that account. Then they'll start reconnaissance. They'll start exploring how far can these privileges be escalated as this user to access resources within the organization. And when you have that centralized reporting and you have a tight governance around what identities, what groups are allowed to access what resources, things are less likely to fall through the cracks in the event that account does get compromised.
And there are additional things that we put into place around identity. Conditional access is a really big one.
Yep.
And what would be the number one security posture that someone should take, or their very first step into the security posture that they should take when they're looking at identity?
Ooh, I know this one. Multi-factor authentication.
Yes.
Modern multi-factor authentication.
That's a really good point.
So traditional multi-factor, a lot of times you'd have SMS messages come to you to validate your identity. And I was just reading a story this morning, actually, about the underground network of T-Mobile and Verizon employees that would just get texts from organized crime groups to say, hey, just port this number really quick.
Wow.
So you lose that second factor of authentication if someone yoinks your phone number out from underneath you. So the modern multi-factor uses things like Microsoft Authenticator or Windows Hello for Business. Just stare at your laptop and log in. It makes it a lot harder for an attacker to compromise that identity by taking away that second factor or making it a non-issue.
Yeah. And then adding things like conditional access into place for impossible travel, risky sign-in. Maybe someone's doing something that the algorithm thinks is funky or wrong, so it can send an alert. What are some of these things that it can do for us? So conditional access, maybe you should explain what conditional access is.
Yeah, so it's a set of rules that are wrapped around the identity provider itself, and it can dictate things like, is this person coming from a resource that I trust? Has the person provided multi-factor authentication, or is it just single factor, God forbid? Where's this person coming from? What browser are they using? If they show up in Munich at the same time they show up in Manhattan, then something's probably wrong.
Yeah.
Recent case we ran across where somebody was providing their username and password to someone and then providing the multi-factor over the phone. You wouldn't typically see that in an alerting signal unless we had sign-in risk turned on, and obviously that client did. They saw the sign-in risk increase, and that behavior was immediately stopped because they realized, oh wait, we shouldn't be sharing authentication information with somebody else on the West Coast.
Even though we have to do this in You'd be surprised what people will do. I think that we can put in as many levels as possible to stop them, and that's what we're really trying to do.
Yep.
But we're also not trying to ruin the user experience. With some of these things that we're adding, we can take away other things. So I remember, many years ago, they were like, well, one day we're going to have these like 24-character passwords that are all special and all of these other things. What is your opinion on doing that? Does every person need to generate out some like insane password, or should they be using multi-factor or a combination of a strong authenticated password that's maybe shorter? Because as you know, anything above like 10 or 12 characters, people forget.
Yep.
Or they write down. God forbid they write it down somewhere.
Yep. Well, you have Mickey and Minnie and Goofy and all the other characters, and anything more than 5, I can't remember. But yes, multi-factor does reduce the need to have a more complex password. But the idea and even where Microsoft is headed is toward passkeys,
Yes.
where you don't even have to know a password.
I don't
to get
know
in.
my password. I haven't in like over a year.
Yeah.
If you ask me my FSI password, good luck.
Yeah, no, I stare at my computer and log in, and then if Windows Hello fails, I'm having a bad day resetting my password.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
I mean, self-service password reset, another nice feature.
Another nice feature. Yeah, I didn't have to call into the desk to get it reset or anything like
Yeah.
that, and could just reset it via my authenticator.
Yeah. It's really nice because your authenticator, your phone, and the authenticator app really becomes that central like hard token.
Yep.
And I actually love the authenticator app. I use it outside of just Microsoft. I don't know how many people know that you can do that, but it's totally possible to use it with other providers like Facebook or GitHub or anything that's going to provide you with that like QR code. And I recommend set up multi-factor on everything. This isn't just about your managed identity at work, but also outside of work, you should be setting up multi-factor. And I think most organizations are now enforcing it. Banks and such have for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have the option on some sites, and a lot of people are just like, no, that's too much work.
Yeah.
Why is it not too much work? What does that 30 seconds save you? Like, what can this one the number matching prevent you from, really? Because we've talked about, oh, well, a user can get compromised. What can they do with that compromised data if they, say, are able to access SharePoint?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people reuse the same password.
So they get more than that.
Elephant in the room. So, yeah, if you start prowling around trying to understand, let's say you get a piece of malware on your endpoint, right? They can look through, understand your website history, look at any session tokens that you may have to different services, etc. You have multi-factor turned on for those accounts. Doesn't really do the attacker a lot of good at that point.
Yeah.
They can hijack your session potentially if they get on the cookie in the right amount of time.
Yeah, it's usually 30 seconds, so it's a pretty quick. I mean, it has been proven that it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you've got to be Johnny on the spot with that.
Yeah, it's a very specialized niche in attacking multi-factor enabled accounts.
Yeah.
For that,
it's not. I don't think that you're going to see that very much in SMB. Mm-hmm. That those are, I think, going to be more targeted and probably towards like giant corporations or people that they want to target, specific people. You always see these political hacks and things like that. I think that those are the people that might be more targeted for that type of attack.
Indeed.
Yeah. How about, so we've gone through, you log in, you use multi-factor or some other thing. What about YubiKeys? What about other tokens that are out there? Can they be utilized with Entra? Can I use a YubiKey alongside my Windows desktop, or am I only locked into that authenticator app?
I believe the new YubiKey is supported.
Yeah.
That was how long ago? A month or so?
Yeah, not too long ago.
Yeah. So we have to keep up on the preview stuff here. Pop quiz, CTO.
Pop quiz time coming from John, who read some article like a week ago or whatever. Yeah.
No, absolutely. You can use YubiKeys. If you just want to keep it entirely in the Microsoft ecosystem, a lot of people just use Authenticator and Windows Hello for Business and Bob's your auntie. That's it.
Yeah, I think for most organizations, that's more than enough. If you really want a YubiKey, like you said, it's available and you can integrate it. And what about any of the additional features that, Entra is huge. It's becoming even bigger. I think that's why they changed the name for the millionth time. But it's become a platform on its own at this point. And we're seeing it. I mean, we use it for literally everything, for SSO to conditional access. What about deploying a policy like MFA? Can we use conditional access to enable policies? And then at what granular level can that policy be enabled?
Yeah, you can go banana pants with it. You can get so deep in the weeds. But yes, you would have a conditional access policy for things like disabling legacy authentication, forcing a re-authentication if there's unfamiliar sign-in properties.
Mm-hmm.
In the going back to the original question, which was,
can we use it for MFA?
Cut that one out. No.
Yeah, no.
Can we use it for MFA?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the primary thing that you should enable.
Mm-hmm.
But with the sign-in risk and user risk metrics as well, you could say, hey, this is a very sensitive SharePoint site. Nobody with a medium or higher sign-in risk can access this SharePoint site.
Yeah.
So as many controls as you want to put around it, Entra can pretty much handle that for you.
And I have one last question for you. Licensing.
Goodbye.
So licensing is always brought up by different people, and you know, we talk to clients about licensing every day, I feel like.
Yep.
What level of licensing is sufficient to get Entra implemented, and what do you believe the minimum licensing level should be?
Well, for the Protect, remind me again. It's Entra P.
Yeah, it's P2 and Business Premium. Yeah, I believe for our internal purposes.
We need the risk metrics. We need the risk metrics.
That's what I was going to get at. What do we need out of these upper level licenses that aid organizations more than like the baseline of conditional access? Don't get me wrong. If you have nothing today, I think it's super important to just get baseline conditional access in place, get multi-factor authentication in place, get some of the self-service password reset. But what do we do that requires those additional licenses?
Well, I mentioned the risk metrics as well, SSPR. Trying to remember that table in my head of what else comes with it. But that just the ability to have the additional telemetry that the license provides gives you additional signals to evaluate your conditional access policies based on.
Yeah.
And then you can make a more educated decision as an administrator. Do I grant access to this resource or not? And
that's kind of the name of the game, right? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the right information, you're not going to be able to make the right decision. And that's the whole thing with MFA fatigue, right? So what MFA fatigue is when, you kept getting that button and you would press it and say, yeah, just get me whatever. Stop making this notification on my phone. I don't care. And people were just saying, yes, accept. And they were circumventing MFA, and that's where number matching came in. Yep. But that can happen to administrators as well. We can get fatigued with, I want to call it PIM fatigue. We run a zero trust organization, or as close to it as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And with that, I know you and I both see 1 million PIMs come in a day. Yeah. And now we see PIMs, plus we see, this enterprise application stuff. And I agree. And I'm kind of getting back to the point that having those additional signals to give us additional information at the screen where we're making a decision, yes or no, is super important.
Yeah. And that's why you have to wrap governance around the PIM roles that can be ordered as well. A lot of people will just say, okay, well, I don't get perma global admin because nobody should have perma global admin. You should have a break glass and maybe a second. That's Microsoft best practice recommendation. Is keep it
2 global 5. I think that, under 5 admins, but I think global admins, they want 2. Yeah. I think you get dinged on your secure score if you go to 3. Mm-hmm. And then I think everything over 3 to 5, it reduces you a couple points until you finally hit that, no, this is real bad.
Yeah. So we do want the ability for people to escalate their privileges, but with that comes the business justification of why are you accessing this particular role? Where a lot of companies don't necessarily take the time to break down what is the task that you're performing and what is the minimally viable set of permissions that you should request in order to
least privilege.
Yes, correct. And everybody has room to improve there for sure. Mm-hmm. But part of the governance that you have to wrap around PIM when you deploy it is just have a cheat sheet.
Yeah.
And just say, hey, I need to do this. I need to assign a license here. What role do I need that is the minimally viable to do that?
And I've actually denied a bunch of PIM requests because people, they don't want to get caught up when they're doing a PIM request is what I've realized. So they go the exact opposite of what we want. And instead of I need user management, or I need Intune management, or I need SharePoint they go global admin. And I just sit there and I'm like, oh. Yeah. And then I hit deny. And then my justification for denying is you don't need global admin. Mm-hmm. And PIM is another thing that you need P2 for as well. So there are these additional features that if you are a growing organization and you have internal IT, there are features that you'll get out of Entra ID that you need to get, and you're going to have to pay for that higher license premium for. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that so that people understand that there is a baseline that you can get with Business Premium, and while it's not perfect, it's probably better than what you're using today. Yeah. Especially if you're just using the de facto Office 365 MFA that I believe is going to be deprecated at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely would
I think
recommend
that's
doing
later
that.
this year.
Yeah.
And you know, as I say during the Protect presentations, you can run the defaults. You
Mhm.
can run the baseline.
Yep.
You can say, this is what my tenant gave me when I stood it up a year ago. Those didn't exist 2-3 years ago.
No.
Those
The security baselines were not a thing.
Right. And even Microsoft say this is a good starting point, but this is not what you should run in production.
Mhm.
This is giving you access to your tenant, your data, and beyond that, make it more granular.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Brian. We're going to talk a little bit later about Intune and some other features, so I'll be happy to have you back on to talk about that. But thanks, everybody, for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.